This message is for YouTube. If you are investigating this video as a result of allegations about copyright infringement or hate speech, please note that any use of copyrighted material in this video falls within the fair use provisions under copyright law. This allows me to use copyrighted material for criticism or parody. The principal purpose of this YouTube channel is for activism for people oppressed by religion, and in particular, Jehovah's Witnesses or Bible students. With regard to hate speech, nothing in this video would constitute hate speech. On April 12, 1999, I celebrated my 44th birthday. We had a little birthday party my wife threw for me that consisted of my two young daughters and my wife and my brother George. It was just the five of us. George at the time could barely eke out a living. He was working with the county road department, and his main job was filling potholes or holding a sign to direct traffic around whatever road work there was. Even that got to be too much for him at one point in time, and he had to quit that job. But with the little money that he had, he brought me a present. It wasn't much of a present, but it was still a thought. It was something that showed he cared. And it was a CD of one of my favorite groups, a band that I heard when I was 17 years old at Madison Square Garden, the Moody Blues. And with the CD, he had a little note. And in the note, he referenced the song Question. And that's what I'm going to read to you now. I'm not able to really load up. I don't want to get into a fight with YouTube over copyright infringement. I wish I could download the song because it's beautiful, but the words are beautiful. My brother wasn't very articulate. He didn't even pass high school. But when it came to music, and he loved music, he had hundreds and hundreds of CDs. He could express himself through the use of music and the lyrics. And this is what that song says. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there is nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is burning in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? Because the truth is hard to swallow. That's what the war of love is for. It's not the way that you say it when you do those things to me. It's more the way that you mean it when you tell me what will be. And when you stop and think about it, you won't believe it's true that all the love you've been giving has all been meant for you. I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. And if you could see what it's done to me, to lose the love I knew could safely lead me through. Between the silence of the mountains and the crashing of the sea, there lies a land I once lived in, and she's waiting there for me. But in the gray of the morning, my mind becomes confused between the dead and the sleeping, and the road that I must choose. I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. And if you could see what it's done to me, to lose the love I knew, could safely lead me to the land that I once knew, to learn as we grow old the secrets of our soul. It's not the way that you say it when you do those things to me. It's more the way you really mean it when you tell me what will be. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000,000,000 questions about hate and death and war? And when we stop and look around us, there is nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is burning in its greed. Why do we never get an answer? That song referred to my parents and his feelings about how we grew up as children in the Bible Students Movement and what it did to him. My brother took his life on June 10th, 2001, on his 44th birthday. He gave me that song on my 44th birthday, and he took his life on his 44th birthday. I can't hear that song anymore without breaking down. I cannot. I just can't. Because I feel the pain and the agony that he felt, and I understand where he was coming from. When we cleaned out his apartment, he had boxes. This was after he had passed away. He had a closet full of boxes full of psych reports. And you'd wonder why. Why would he keep these things? These reports were generated when he would admit himself or be forcibly admitted into mental institutions for attempts to commit suicide. And you would think that he would want these reports, which included some very in-depth discussions about his childhood and the way we grew up. And about 2 years after I cleaned out his apartment, I was able to bring myself to going downstairs in the basement and opening up that box and reading those psych reports. And report after report after report, it was all about our childhood and about the things that had been done and why he felt that he couldn't live any longer. And it all hinged around how we were really second in my parents' life. You know, I know he talked about my parents over and over again. My mother making him up as a little girl, all of the abuse, all of the endless meetings, the torture of growing up as a Bible student child was just too much for him. He couldn't deal with it. He couldn't cope with it, and it eventually broke him down mentally to the point where it just completely ruined his life. And he had a majorly tragic life. It was really tragic, and I understand what he meant when he said, "All the love you've been giving has all been meant for you," because my parents, that's what the religion was. It was talking about love and the love of God and all this love, but there was no love that was directed in our way. And so this video is about my brother. This is a video because he's always on my mind. He passed away almost 20 years ago. I mean, it's 17 years now, and I still suffer from it. There's agony. And I'm going to show a number of pictures. Recently, my cousin loaded up a bunch of my grandfather's slides, digitized them, and put them up. And I wanted you to see that little boy. That little boy that grew up to take his life at 44 years old. And he's that little boy with the cat there. The sweet little blonde-headed boy with a smile. It looked like, you know, he enjoyed life. But, you know, these pictures belie a dark underbelly of our life. You know, this was the facade. This was the family that was the perfect Bible student family. You know, we did what we were told. We wore what we were told to wear, and we had to do what were told to do. And if we didn't, we were severely punished. And I have to admit that some of these slides are not in order. It was very difficult. There were over 2,000 slides that my cousin digitized. But I picked out these of George because I think it shows something that happened. Here in this photograph, you'll see my brother George holding his daughter, his younger daughter. But when I say you see something that happened, what I mean was you look at the differences between the photographs of that little boy with the smile, that little boy with the innocence, and there's nothing but purity and innocence in that little boy. And what happened to make that pure innocence turn to something so ugly, something that so bad that he wanted to take his life, that he did take his life. And that's where the Bible students factor in, because that was the dark underside of our family life. That is what created the dysfunction. The photographs belie a very, very, very strong dysfunction in our family. And we weren't the only Bible student family that had that. There were lots of Bible student families that suffered the same sort of thing. And it was always the kids. It's the kids. The kids today, they don't appreciate what they have. The kids today, they don't know what it was like to grow up in the Depression. The kids today don't understand the blessings that we have in knowing the truth. And we were expected to consecrate. That was the expectation. We were taught the truth as children. I have to stop it here. I had to just stop it at this photograph here, because this photograph is of my brother's older daughter. This is the reason why he got married. I know this is a story that's a little out of line with my brother in the way I'm presenting things right now, but you could see here that this child definitely isn't my brother's child. The girl that he married said that she was pregnant because of my brother. And my parents couldn't have it that a Bible student boy, teen man, and living under their roof. He was only maybe 20 years old, 19 or 20 years old, when his older daughter was born, and this would be a black mark on my father. It would jeopardize his eldership, having this immoral situation of an unwed child in the family. And so my brother was forced into a marriage that he wouldn't have done. He wouldn't have gone into this marriage if he hadn't been forced to. And by this point in his life, he had been so pushed around by my parents that he acquiesced to their pressure and got married because of getting this girl pregnant. And when the child was born, it was obvious to my brother that he wasn't the father. And I understand from my brother that when he went to the hospital to visit and see my brother and his wife, and to congratulate them on the birth of their first child, that my brother was sitting Indian style, cross-legged in the corner, just staring into a corner. He couldn't he couldn't arouse him. He was numb. He just he realized that he had been forced into a major decision in his life, and it wasn't his child. And this was a tragedy that led to other tragedies. My brother's life was a very tragic life. One thing after the next happened to him, and he wasn't able to take care of a family. He had become drug addicted. He had been in jail. He served 30 days in jail. That just so many things had happened to him. You can see the difference as he's older, that there's a marked difference in the expression from a young boy who, with innocence, focus, a young boy that had all his life and all the prospects in front of him. Those are my parents, my dad, the elder, and my brothers, my two younger brothers. You could see there a happy child. What happened? That's me holding my younger brother. I just had to get that picture in there. And that's us. Yes, we as Bible students celebrated Christmas. But while my parents, now look at this photo. You see these photos here. Notice the bump on my brother's head and the bruise there around his eye. My brother, out of frustration, used to bang his head on the floor, and he'd just rock there forever, seemingly. And my parents wouldn't do anything about it. And when my wife asked them about that years later, when she and I got married, my father's retort was, "Well, what could we do about it? He was hurting him more than we could." That was the warped sense of judgment and justice that my father had. But it was something critical that led to my brother wanting to take his life. And it had to do directly with the Bible students. So, hi. I just wanted to give you a very brief, very quick slideshow of that innocence, that boy. And yeah, it was a mixture. It was an eclectic mix of slides of my brother, principally of my brother. I mean, there were some other. I mean, I was in it. My brother, my other younger brother, surviving brother, is the only other member of my family that is surviving. Is my youngest brother. He's done quite well for himself. He's got his PhD last year. He's teaching in university, and yeah, he was fortunate. The three of us were heading into very destructive, self-destructive territory. It just was worse for my brother George. Like I said, he gave me that song, and I think, you know, the words, the melody, especially with the words, really say something to me. And I know it was about my parents. I know it was about the way we were raised, because I read all of the psych reports. I read everything that he had discussed. All of his discussions with the counselors were documented in these very thick psych reports. And he had box after box after box of these psych reports. And we put them down in our basement. You know, we cleared out his apartment, my wife and I, when he passed away. And I think I mentioned this the last time. I will never forget the smell of death. He had been dead in his apartment for a week before his counselor had found him. He was under a Section 8 government subsidy where he had a small stipend for spending, and they took care of his rent in an efficiency apartment in Hackensack. And he was supposed to attend counseling twice a week. The counselor didn't check up on him for a week, and they found him, and he was in a pretty deteriorated state. And so that stench, I mean, there were body fluids on the bed, and the stench was just pervasive through. You could even smell it in the hall to some extent. And at the time I was drinking, and I had to get myself pretty well drunk before I could enter that apartment and clear out the meager belongings. I mean, he didn't have much. He had essentially nothing except all those boxes of psych reports. And when I think about the words of that, song, that poem, that beautiful poem, it's obvious. I mean, he was confused. The questions, a world of persecution. Everything that the Bible students stand for. The Bible students believe that they have a plan, that God has this plan, and that He allows humankind to suffer for thousands of years, and then sent His Son to die as a deliverer, as a ransomer for humankind, so that in a world that God's going to establish in His 1,000-year kingdom, it will be a kingdom of righteousness that will be ruled by 144,000, and it will be nothing but complete bliss and joy for people, and that there will be perfection, there will be no disease, there will be no more death, no more sorrow, there will be all tears would be wiped away, all maladies would be corrected, and there would be no pestilence, no strife among people, and this is the world that they told us was going to exist. This is the world that we were told that was going to come after this world of pain and anguish. But why would God permit 6,000 years of this anguish and agony? I mean, today is the best time for humanity. There has been never a time like this ever in human history for being able to have some measure of happiness in life. And many of us are happy despite the things that happen to us. Life is something we wouldn't want to give up, something that we cling to strongly. Even cancer patients cling to life to the very last, and it's something that's built within us. And this day and age, with all of the marvels and all of the things that make life a joy and ease for us, there's been no other time like the present to live. Why has God permitted humans to live in such agony? And even today, with all of the things that make our lives so much better, there is a tremendous amount of suffering, because those things that give us joy, those things that make our life easier, are not evenly distributed amongst all of us. There are millions of people in Africa and Asia and all throughout the world, through South America, that are suffering from abject poverty, that don't have full stomachs, that life is very painful for them, suffering, and yet they cling to hope. They cling to life, and what could cause somebody to want to lose that desire to live? It has to be something that's pretty powerful. It has to be something that really screws up our genetic predisposition toward life. Oh, and here's one right now. See that
Grandpa?
little? That's my grandson.
Grandpa?
Yeah. The joy of my life.
Bye.
So, back again. Of course, I'm going to stop the video when my grandson's here. We're truly blessed with the family that we have. Somehow, some way, we survived. We raised two of our children in a cult, and not only in a cult, but at the center of the cult. We lived and worked at the Dawn Bible Students Association. It's like living and working at the Bethel, except we had children. We survived. We're survivors. It's a miracle. Yeah, we took our knocks, and there wasn't a piece of cake, but we applied ourselves. It took a lot of work, it took a lot of effort, and it also took something that my father couldn't do. My father couldn't ask for help. My father, one of the other elders who was a rival of my dad's in the Bible Students Ecclesia, New York Bible Students Ecclesia, said that my father was the proudest man he ever knew, and he said it to my father's face. He was also another one of the Dawn managers. They had a rivalry going for years, and my father more or less took one out until he had a stroke. But this other fella, I knew it got under my dad's skin, and he said that he was very proud because the Bible students make a real issue about pride. They make a real issue about humility and being humble. But it was absolutely true. My father could never ask for help. He never asked for help. And he just couldn't bring himself to doing so. And at the same time, I don't think he really cared. He was more concerned about his own aggrandizement. You know, I'm not saying these things because I like to, or I'm not saying these things because I really want to. But I have to understand what happened. It took the life of my brother. It almost took my life. I thought my brother's way of dealing with things was probably the right way when I was at a low point, and I wouldn't have that wonderful little boy in my life if I had done so. And it would have prolonged the agony in my family. I mean, I suffer from my brother's death, and it's evident that I still suffer from his death. And just to think that that's what I would be leaving my daughters, and it would just pass on down from generation to generation. The legacy of dysfunction that really peaked with my childhood family My two brothers, me, my parents, the dysfunction absolutely peaked at that point in our lives, in our family chain. And I put a stop to it, but I had to ask for help. I couldn't be so much like my father that I couldn't ask for help. I came to the point where I realized that things were out of my control. The things that had to be done were things that I didn't know how to do. I couldn't navigate through life. It was just unfortunate that my brother couldn't cope. He didn't have something. There was something lacking in his character, his makeup, that prevented him from being able to withstand the abuse that we suffered as children. And I'm speaking about this openly and honestly, and it doesn't give me any, like I said, any pleasure doing so. And I'm not feeling any anger about this. Yes, such things anger me, especially when I hear it happening with other people and with other families. But I think maybe our experience could be helpful to others, that there maybe give somebody hope that despite how you were raised, despite the indoctrination that you were raised with, despite the dysfunction that may occur, the self-destructive behavior that results, that there is some hope, that there is a way out, and that there is a way to find a life that's beautiful. I could have ended it like my brother, but then I wouldn't be living the beautiful life that I have. Humility is not acting holy or meeting behavioral expectations. Oh my goodness, there was a hummingbird about 10 feet away from me. And it's a ruby-throated hummingbird, and it's sitting on a branch. The thing is only about 3 inches long. Those are amazing little creatures. I just find them fascinating. We see them every year here. They like our Rose of Sharon on the side of the yard. You can't see it here, but they really enjoy that. They come every year for that. But let me tell you a little about that little boy that you saw, that innocence. How could it result in suicide? And there's my wife. She's on a mission to kill a wasp that got into our house. Well, the Bible student's lifestyle is one in which the children are secondary to the ambitions of the parent. Now, when I brought a child into this world, I realized maybe it's a different point of view. I did think about the things that my parents did that I wasn't going to do as a parent. I certainly wasn't perfect in doing that, but at least I gave it a try. And there were some things that were critical that I was not going to do with my children. That happened with us as we were raised. And one of those things, a key thing, was that we weren't going to impose our religion on them more so than what we were already willing to impose upon ourselves. Now, my wife and I, we, for our various reasons, uh, joined the Bible students. And when I say joined, I was born and raised in the Bible students, but you're not really considered a Bible student until you baptize. So you even though you were born and raised in it, you're not considered part of the club unless you baptize and consecrate. I think it's probably the same way with Jehovah's Witnesses, that you're really not a Jehovah's Witness unless you baptize. And that is sort of a contract between you and God. And that it obligates you to putting godly things first in your life. And this is where Bible students use that scripture. I come not to Jesus. There's something in the Gospels about Jesus saying, "Think not that I have come to make peace, but instead I've come to make war and to put sword between father and son, and mother-in-law, there's that set of scriptures that says that there were going to be divisions, and that's what Bible students very, very strongly adhere to, this idea that once you were consecrated, you were wholly and totally committed to giving your life over completely to God. And what giving your life over completely to God meant was putting absolutely everything secondary in your life, except seeking the heavenly things, the kingdom of heaven. And for Bible students, it was to be part of the 144,000. That's where the difference between most Jehovah's Witnesses and Bible students resides. The Bible students were the forerunners of the Jehovah's Witnesses. At one time, when the Watchtower was solely comprised of Bible students, every single member who was a consecrated brother and a consecrated member of the Bible students and baptized, which sealed, it was sort of the seal of that consecration vow. The consecration was a vow between you and God on an individual basis to wholly commit your life to God, to be part of the 144,000, and nothing less than that was expected of you. And so there was a culture that Bible students established that were based on a set of values that were created by the pastor, by Russell, as being key values, key morals, upon which a person living by those morals demonstrates that they are living up to their consecration commitment. And this sword between father and son and so on is there when the child doesn't accept the religion for themselves, for their own, on their own. So this is a great point of concern amongst Bible students who have children, to raise them in the truth, but not only to raise them in the truth, but to bring them to the point, indoctrinate them to the point where they too will become consecrated. They'll want to consecrate their lives to God, and they will commit by they will symbolize that commitment by their baptism, and it passes on from generation to generation. And but this is the key duty of a Bible student parent. Now, if the child rebels, if the child doesn't want anything to do with the religion, the parent's first obligation remains their consecration. And so that means they will neglect their child, and their child they will provide what they believe to be is their obligatory responsibility to support the child, dress, feed, care, indoctrinate. But if that child doesn't respond to, it's almost an embarrassment to the Bible student parent, and they will then reject that child by ostracism. And it isn't like an official thing, it is the same as treating that child as a worldly person. Bible students are not to mix with the world. Bible students are not to form close ties and friendships with people in the world. Now, Bible students who had close ties and friendships in the world were usually the Bible students that were consecrated later. They weren't born and raised Bible students, like my grandfather, who was born a Protestant. He was a Presbyterian when he was born, and he was converted by my grandmother to the Bible students. This is on my mother's side. And so he had a number of worldly friends that were friends for life. But there was always a clear-cut distinction. There were the worldly friends, and then there were the Bible student friends. In fact, that's what they call them, and I think Jehovah's Witnesses call their congregational associates friends also. And it is this obligation to the consecration on the part of the Bible students, and in a way, with Jehovah's Witnesses, it's their consecration to the organization. That's what their baptism is for, is their dedication to the organization. They say Jehovah, but Jehovah has an organization, so to be dedicated to Jehovah, you're dedicated to Jehovah's organization. And that's where the mixing and the melding, it's sort of like an amoebic border. You don't really know where Jehovah begins and the organization ends. They kind of meld together. And that was kind of like that in the Bible students. Because the Bible students were certainly smaller, and I knew a great deal of them. In fact, the majority of Bible students I did know to some degree, certainly by name and then by relation. There was very little distinction between our nuclear family and the extended Bible students. There was this amorphic absorption, almost like an amoebic absorption by the religion, by the fellowship itself, and you were absorbed into it. And that was the way life was in the Bible students. And certainly that was the way our parents, who were committed to their service to God, they were a part of this amorphous entity called the Bible students. In fact, it was almost like an extended family. They Bible student parents would put their children in a situation. It was almost like a communal. You put your child, under the control and the influence of the other Bible student, elders and teachers and so on. My parents had, rather than keeping us close to them and saying, well, take that with a grain of salt. They just put us out there and basically let the Bible students raise us. That's really what it was. My parents didn't take the time. They were too busy doing their own service. And service to the Bible students was attending meetings and this character development. Now, this is where the difference between Jehovah's Witnesses and Bible students came in. In the 1920s, Joseph Rutherford said, enough of this character development business. Let's get down to some practical brass tacks. It's not about character development anymore. That was, God, he had a name for it. He called it the Elijah part of the movement. And Russell was the Elijah part. Now it was a new phase since 1919. I forget what he called that new phase, but it was no longer about character development. And Rutherford said, if you're still about character development, you're all wrong. You're out of sync with Jehovah. And if you're out of sync with Jehovah, then you're out of sync, period, and you have nothing to do with Jehovah. And so that was the pressure that he put on the membership. So that's where the distinction came. And many felt that this was being disloyal to Russell. And so that's what resulted in the big split in the 1920s. Rutherford, he had bigger and better things for the organization. And he said 1922 was a watershed year because it gave clear direction to the activities of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And that was advertise. You had to go door to door. And it was no more about personal character development, but bringing in as much wheat as possible. And later he saw the possibilities were limitless if he, through the Jonadab idea, and by saying that the great company was interpreting new light, that the great company was no longer a heavenly class, that the Jehovah's Witnesses now were bringing in those that were going to live through Armageddon. These were going to be the ones that inherited the kingdom. They were the Jonadab class, which was the great crowd or the great company class. And so now the focus, the direction was in something different from character development. But the level of commitment expected was no different. So while it was Russell and character development, or Rutherford and advertise, doing activities and following up and tracking those activities, actions, doing something, works, basically, like the book of James, it's faith without works is dead. The works was the measure by which Jehovah's Witnesses marked someone's commitment. But the level of commitment, expectations were the same. It was supposed to be full and complete and total. So despite whether or not it was consecration to character development or consecration, I think they dropped the word consecration, but dedication or commitment to the works, going door to door, it was total. It was all of your energy was expected to be put toward those ends, whatever ends it was, i.e., consecration to character development or consecration to the activities of bringing in people to the New World Society. So that level of commitment remained the same from the Bible students into the Jehovah's Witnesses. So this is what we're raised with. Despite the fact whether or not you were a Jehovah's Witness child or a Bible student child, our parents were consecrated and committed to something other than raising your child. Your child was secondary. And in fact, it's obvious that families aren't as important, because now Jehovah's Witnesses shunned by official policy, which means that they have broken the family ties. They have succeeded in making those secondary familial love secondary to the parent who is committed to God, Jehovah. And making a child secondary means that you raise them and you believe that you have the right to raise them in any way you see fit. And in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, the organization tells you what is fit and what is necessary and what the child is expected, how a parent is expected to raise the child. And the Bible students aren't too far behind in that respect, because they had Russell, who wrote the 6th volume. And the 6th volume is all about that thick, all about the practical aspects of consecration and what it means. And in there, it's defined in such a way that children are not the principal concern of the parent. And that means that in the same sense, Bible student children were not their parents' primary concern, in the same way that Jehovah's Witness parents were not, their children were not their first concern. I think there's something that we have to do to prevent ourselves from deluding ourselves and thinking that we were raised in a way that other Christian children were raised. And the fact that other Christians are not required to dedicate their lives through consecration in such a complete and total way. This is something that's unique to the Bible students and to the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's why they're cults. That's why both sects are cults, because of this expectation of commitment and the level, the degree to which that commitment is made. Again, the sword, I come not. Okay? but I came to put sword between family members. To Bible students, that was taken literally. So if you as a Bible student child didn't get on board with the expectations, then you were a problem child. You were you were ostracized in a way. You were actually stereotyped, and once you were stereotyped, there was no changing your image in the Bible students. Once a bad guy, you were always a bad guy, and that's how I was branded. In fact, actually, when my wife, who she was relatively a newcomer to the Bible students when I met her, her father had been a Bible student but a loner for many years. He had been baptized, but his wife never, my mother-in-law never accepted the Bible students. In fact, she was very, very strongly against it. And because of his job, he didn't live in cities where there were Bible student classes, so he was pretty much alone. And he did what he could to raise the children, my wife and her 3 siblings, as much in the truth as possible. But they didn't go to all the meetings, all the conventions. And so as an adult, when she started attending some of the conventions, she was love bombed. She was something. Bible students are just like Jehovah's Witnesses in that sense. That a newcomer, somebody new, they get all the attention, they get all the love, until they become a known entity, and then their foibles, are held against them, and then they know that they're part of the Bible student fellowship, and sometimes it's a very rude awakening, because they will do things that will, talking behind your back and this and that, and you find yourself in one little clique or camp, and so there is a rude awakening at some point for new people that haven't had much in the way of experience with the Bible students. But with my wife, that was the way she was. She was a stunning young lady, beautiful, and she was new to pretty much everybody, and so she was sort of everybody's little darling when she first started attending the General Convention. And when I came and back, the bad boy, after missing the General Convention for several years, I came back and I met her, and I fell head over heels for her, and she and I hit it off really well, because she realized that I was sort of a rebel. But Bible students were coming up to her after she and I were engaged. Actually, 3 weeks after she and I met, we may be in for a storm. After we met, we were engaged. And we went to the New York Labor Day Convention together, and Bible student sisters started coming up to her and telling her, "You better watch out for that so-and-so. He's bad news." They were warning her against me, even though I had just baptized, and I was showing every indication that I was repentant of my bad ways, and that I was seeking to rectify my sinful life and conform, you see, because I myself was getting into trouble. But so what does this all have to do with my brother? Well, this culture, my brother needed attention. My brother needed help, and my parents weren't there to help him. He started getting into drugs in junior high school around the age of 12, 13. Initially, it was amphetamines, pills, and and marijuana. But then in high school, you know, after I graduated, my brother was 2 years. My second brother was George, was 2 years younger than me, and James was four. My youngest brother, 4 years younger than me. And so when I graduated from high school, my parents moved to another 26 miles away. We were already living in the suburbs at that point of New York City, and I think my parents the real reason that they were moving, they wanted to move us away from where there were bad influences, and they believed that in the suburban area where we were, even though it was an affluent affluent area, 13th richest county in the United States. I mean, that's not chicken feed. I mean that we were a fairly affluent, very typical U.S. Stereotypical county, and drugs were a part of the scene, especially in the late '60s and early '70s. And my parents were their action was not to seek help, but to run, to escape. And they moved us out into the woods, literally, where they thought that people were chased, and people, there were no drugs, and my brothers couldn't get in trouble. Well, it was just the opposite of what they thought. If we had stayed where we were in Nanuet, we probably would have gotten into less trouble than he did, but that's only speculation. But my brother's drug habit became worse, and it was exacerbated by some of the strange situations out there. There was an ashram where Timothy Leary had an associate. His name is Dr. Mishra, and they were using mind expanding drugs back in the 50s and 60s, and my brothers they took advantage of the situation. The ashram was only about a mile and a half from where we lived. There was some strange stuff out there, really weird. You want weirdness, you go out to the country, because that's where people escape mainstream attention. And this was one of them. Now today, that ashram is mainstream. The worst you can get are beanstalks, bean sprouts, and health food. But back then, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, it was a drug called LSD. And my brother also did PCP, and he also did heroin. And he really connected with some really bad individuals there. And now my parents, they were lower middle class working people. My father worked as a computer programmer, but he didn't have a college degree. He went to a technical school and became educated that way. A 5-month course in computer programming, and he got a job with the State Board of Education, and he did programming for things like payroll and stuff like that. It wasn't difficult programming, um, and he worked for the state, and the state doesn't pay a particularly large salary. And after 10 years, my dad retired with a meager retirement pension. Um, my mother worked for the same outfit, Board of Education, as a administrative assistant, as they say. Back then they called them secretaries. So she wasn't really earning a large amount of money, but she did get some, and she also had a small pension from that. And but they did have tremendous benefits, and they could have had any of the medical attention or psychiatric attention that was necessary if they had only given it some concern. But you see, the things that were happening in our family were so egregious to the Bible student culture. My father was afraid of losing his eldership. He coveted that eldership. He used to brag to us, only in our family. He never really did it outside of the family, but to us boys, he was very proud of the fact that he had become an elder at the age of 23. And that was his big thing. And, he put off any opportunity to go, let's say, the hard route to better himself. He wanted to better himself. He wanted to do better, but he did so only in the easy way, and that's why he took a Chubb course for computer programming. He never really had a college education. They were certain that the kingdom was going to come. I mean, I grew up believing that I wasn't going to be an adult because the kingdom was going to come. And we were told this over and over again, that the kingdom was going to come and that all the world's problems were going to be solved, and that we wouldn't have a chance to really live life in this world, that we were only going to be able to know and grow basically up in the kingdom. And the kingdom was never came. We were living in the time of trouble, and things were getting worse and worse and worse, according to the Bible students. But the great time of trouble never culminated in what they called Jacob's trouble, or Armageddon. And so, here we are. I'm 63 years old, and we still don't have the kingdom. And I have a wonderful little grandson who we just adore. My wife and I mean, she's head over heels over that little boy. And he's a fantastic little thing. And we loved our kids just that way. That was one of the key reasons why we were different from other Bible student families, because we were not willing to put our children second to our consecration. That was part of the reason why we were so conflicted, especially me, because I knew what the Bible student expectations were, and I wasn't living them. I was conflicted all that time for a long time. Call it cognitive dissonance. But cognitive dissonance is dissonance is like banging the keyboard with all your fingers on a piano and just pounding it, bang, bang, bang. There's no musical harmony, no note, no melody, no tone, just noise. That's what dissonance is. Cognitive dissonance is that same sort of thing, but in your mind you're scrambled because the things that you were taught that were important, but intuitively your sense is that this isn't right, and so you're conflicted. it creates an internal conflict, and it also creates an external conflict, especially when your spouse sees things a little bit more clearly because she was not raised in the same with the same idea of total and absolute commitment to the religion. I knew what the expectations were for my family, but I wasn't willing to do it because my love for my children was so strong. So it created a problem for me internally. I mean, I was screwed up and I didn't know how to handle it. But my brother wasn't even, at least I had some direction. There were certain things I knew I wanted, like an education. Even though I was raised, and okay, this is where a lot of Bible students, yes, have college degrees, but I was given over to the Bible students where we were taught that a college education was not desirable because it would make you an atheist or you would believe in evolution. And this was pounded in us by one of the prominent elders that took an interest in the youth. And I be damned if a single one of my contemporary Bible student peers could deny that that was not emphasized, that college education was discouraged very, very strongly. Even though many of them went to college, they were rebels. They defied this, and they took offense to the fact that here they were in college and they were being told college was wrong and evil. If it was Jehovah's Witnesses today, they'd probably be disfellowshipped and out on the street. Bible students, because of the size and because of the lack of centralized organization, the ostracizing was actually done with a little less emphasis. It was not like an official thing that people imposed on others, but it happened. It happened. I'm ostracized. I mean, I'm not officially disfellowshipped, but I have family members who will keep their contact with me at an absolute minimum. It's not that they won't talk to me, but we won't have any conversation, not like we used to have, because I'm not in the truth anymore. And, these expectations, my brother knew what those expectations were too. And here he was, on one hand, rebelling for his life by that's where something like a cult is so destructive, because often when you're born and raised in it, you're rebelling against the values, and that rebellion includes self-destructive behavior. Getting into drugs, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, and doing things that are against the culture's virtues. And you find yourself in big trouble before too long. And then the religion says, see, we were right. And people like me come back. And then you can't live it down because they've got the goods on you. It's like emotional blackmail. But to my brother, even though he never came back and immersed himself, he couldn't give up the idea. He subscribed to the Dawn magazine to the day he died. He was reading that junk. He knew what it was. He knew what the expectations were, and that he hadn't lived up to them, and that he wasn't living up to them, and he was certain he was going to second death, and that gave him great, great distress, to the point where he'd rather end it all and put himself out of his misery. And the confluence of all of the tragedy that happened in his life, that the confluence of those things with the Bible student's expectations and values, and the idea that he was going to second death, gave him tremendous emotional distress, and he snapped, and he became schizophrenic. And I don't think the drugs helped any. I mean, he had a serious drug problem. He declined to the point where he was only 44 years old when he died. The last 15 years of his life, he was in and out of psych wards 2 to 3 times a year for attempts on suicide attempts. And he would stay in a hospital for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they'd let him back out again when he seemed like he was no longer a threat. But he had GAF scores. Now, GAF is your ability to function in society. Look it up in Wikipedia, GAF, and it's a scoring system. And the higher the number, you can function well in society. Let's say it's a 0 to 100 scale, and if you get 100, you function well in society. You get 1 or 2 or a 10 or 15, then you are not able to function in society. You are a danger to yourself and to others. And my brother fell into that category. He one GAF score was 15, and then another time he was tested, it was 5. I mean, it got too much for him to be able to fill potholes. So, I mean, that's the level of stress that he wasn't able to handle any longer. I mean, you saw the pictures. He was a strong, big. I mean, he could have been a professional athlete. He had amazing hand-eye coordination, and I'm not kidding. I wasn't bad. I was a good basketball player. I was not too bad off athletically. My brother had me outdone hands down. He set the school record for throwing we used to have these presidential awards, and George could throw the ball further in 7th grade than any of the coaches. It was like, I don't know, he threw a softball like 235 feet or something like that. It was just phenomenal. And there wasn't even a coach in the school that could throw the ball that far. he held. He may still hold the record for the 440 race, which is a lap around the track. He was so fast, you could not knock him down. He had this incredible cat-like sense of balance. From a physical point of view, my brother was just phenomenal. But it was his emotional side that was a wreck. And I can understand it, because I was heading in the same direction. He really honestly thought that he was going into second death. Second death is like the analog, the Bible student analog to Christian hell, except there isn't suffering and torture. In fact, I think it's worse. I propose that it's worse, because at least in hell, you see, the human spirit is such that there is hope springs eternal, right? That if there is a chance, if you have any consciousness at all in hell, then there's always the hope that you might get out of that hell. And so that's just human nature. with the Bible student and Jehovah's Witness idea of going into non-existence, there's no hope. You're gone, and that's it. And it's almost more distressing than if you had some sort of hope. But the things that were happening to my brother, I mean, he to keep up his habit, he ended up robbing people. He would get into trouble with that. Some of our Bible student friends were dealing drugs, and he stole a pound of marijuana from them, and that turned into a complete mess because the individual involved was also an auxiliary New York City policeman, and he dressed up in his police uniform and sought out my brother, found him in high school, uh, and handcuffed him, dragged him outside at knife point, and beat him up with his billy club. And the real police were called and arrested him and for impersonating an officer, which is a serious felony. And he managed to get out of that. I mean, somehow, someway, the courts were lenient with him, and they should have. But there were. I mean, the drugs were coming from within the Bible student kids themselves. I mean, we were not the renegades. This was not unusual. Of the 60 or in between 60 and 100 of us Bible student kids in the New York metropolitan area, which included Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Long Island, and New York City itself, we were all brought together by our parents on a monthly basis. There were the good ones, the conformists, and there were us, the rebels. And we got into all kinds of trouble. And my brother was not beyond stealing. He had broken into a business in town, in the town that we lived in, this rural area that my parents thought would be a healthy environment for my brother. He, I believe, got a probation for that. Then he got into trouble a couple of times, and finally they caught him with a small amount of marijuana on him, and the judge realized that he had repetitive legal problems, so he ordered, it was court-ordered counseling, and 30 days in the county jail. So my brother got locked up for 30 days. Now, this was really distressing to me. Now, I was perplexed. First off, my parents, despite what those photos looked like, my parents raised us to have some division between us. And that was principally my father. My two younger brothers were almost inseparable with one another, and I was separate from them. I had separate friends. I rarely did things with them. They were my brothers, but I think probably it had something to do with the fact that my father wanted me, and in fact held me to basically watching over my two brothers. I was held responsible for them and their actions, and I was made aware of that all the time, especially when I failed and they got into trouble. I was the one held responsible for their behavior, and my father would then get down on my tail end, and he would tell me, that I should be like him and live my life beyond reproach, and be an example to my two brothers, and that I was responsible for their behavior. And I heard that a lot, and I didn't want any responsibility for them. I shouldn't and it wasn't right of my father to expect that I was to be their watchdog, to be their parent in essence. And I mean, when my parents manned the World's Fair Bible student booth, um, they'd be there for hours, and I think that there was a 4 or 8 hour stint because there weren't that many people who could be at the booth. It had to be, somebody had to be at the booth at all times. It was the World's Fair requirements, and this was in 1965. And so my parents, they didn't want children hanging around the booth, and so they told us to go out and make ourselves gone. And I was responsible for watching my two brothers for hours and hours and hours while we were wandering around the World's Fair on our own. I was 9 and 10 years old then, and responsible for watching a 7 and 8 year old, because the World's Fair was held for 2 years, 1964 and 1965. And my youngest brother, he was 5 and 6. We were little boys walking around the World's Fair. And it wasn't one time. This was frequent. And this was something so there was always a problem between me. I didn't want that responsibility, so it created a wedge between me and my two brothers. And then me and my younger brother and I, we were very similar in personality, very strong-headed, and my brother George was a little more malleable. He was like the peacemaker between us. He was the guy that could bridge us. James and I fought as kids, and there was a lot of antagonism between us as children, and that actually didn't rectify itself until adulthood, until we were in our 20s. Actually, there was a time when I reached out to him and I took him on a camping trip. I wanted to bond with him, and we ended up getting blasted out of our skulls drunk. But that's a whole different story. But the types of things that happened, when I say tragedies, there was a photograph that went through in that very quick slideshow. You saw a little baby that my mother was holding. It was a little baby girl. She was dark, very dark skinned. My brother was associated with this girl, and she said that he got her pregnant. And she was actually she had quite a few lovers at that time, and my brother was one of them. And she claimed that he was the father of the child that she was bearing. And there was no way of telling in those days. I mean, they didn't have ultrasound. They didn't have the medical technology to distinguish in those days. So it was just accepted that what she said was true. And this really got under my dad's skin, because this jeopardized his eldership, to have a son who had a child out of wedlock. In fact, I was bad enough. I mean, my mother got on me over and over and over again, because I was having a relationship with my high school girlfriend. We eventually became engaged for a short period, but we were sleeping together, and my mother told me that was immoral over and over again, and that I should get married. No, my brother came under the same kind of pressure, except he gave in. And my father was really proud of himself for having gotten my brother to see reason. And her mother, on the other hand, was eager to see her daughter out of the house and was happy that she didn't have to raise a teenage daughter and a baby at the same time. So here's my brother, who is barely 20. I think he was 19, drug addicted, alcohol addicted. He was turning tricks with gay men to get money for the drugs that he needed. The and There was no way. I mean, he hadn't graduated high school, and there was no way for him to be able to support a family. And this is what he looked like at his wedding. Now, my grandfather took a number of these slides at my wedding and at my brother's wedding. Now, my brother got married only a month or let's say 2 months after my wife and I did, and this was not a marriage of love. This was a forced marriage. My parents really pushed them to get married, and mainly because it was my father's regard for his eldership. He was concerned over what it would look like to the Bible students. He had ambitions. He had goals. He wanted to be the managing editor of the Dawn when he retired, and he was approaching his retirement years here, and this could be a scandal that would prevent him from attaining his goal. But he wasn't thinking about my brother and his welfare and the welfare of the child and the welfare of everybody involved. It was only his own welfare that he was thinking of, and it led to a disastrous marriage, and led to a series of consequences that built upon one disaster after the next. Here you could see, I mean, it's obvious. When you look at these pictures, you'll see that my brother just wasn't really excited about this wedding. In fact, in some photographs, he looked like a deer in headlights. He just wasn't with it. He just wasn't there. Now, his wife, his bride, she was happy because now she got herself out of trouble. A single girl giving birth out of wedlock, even in the 70s, carried some degree of stigma to it. So she was happy that she got somebody on the hook. But if you remember that picture that I in the slides, the little girl that was born out of a union that my brother's wife had. Again, she had a number of lovers at the time. Resulted in a baby with much darker skin than my brother, and he realized instantly when she was born that she was not his, and apparently that sent him into a deep depression. When my brother went to visit them in the hospital, my brother was just sitting on the floor staring into space. It was almost like a catatonic situation. He realized that he had been played for a fool. And right now I see a huge thunderstorm behind me, and I may have to move this indoors in a minute. It is really gray. See? I have to do something about this. I can't stay out here any longer. This is one bad storm coming up behind me. They pop up really fast. Look at that. That's pretty ominous. And the storm front hasn't even really come yet. So it's pretty nasty. I see the rain on the mountain over there. And I will be heading indoors ASAP. So, I'll see you later. Now, I'm indoors. It's starting to clear up a little out there, but still raining, and I'm not able to set up outside. But look at these photos. You can tell this is my brother at his wedding. The wedding was held at her parents' house, and you can see there's just, he's not with it. He's not into this. When my parents went over to his apartment, he was living in a one room, basically a dump. My mother went over with my wife, and she saw my brother sitting on the floor in a heap. And she said, George, what are you going to wear for your wedding? Your wedding is today. And my wife, she could see instantaneously that this was a travesty. This was a disaster. He did not want to be at this wedding. My mother got his clothes out and dressed him for the wedding. He did not want to be here, and you could see that on the look on his face. Here's another one. He's scared. He looks like a deer in headlights with this photo. He was just forced into this marriage. This was not a wedding of love. This was not, he was forced into this thing by my parents and by her parents. People can interfere and do such terrible things when it's none of their business. It just was none of their business. And my father was just more worried about his own ambitions, his own status with the Bible students, with the New York Ecclesia, losing his eldership, than he was with my brother's welfare. This is the entire happy family. Look at my father. He looks like he dodged a bullet. He's happy. I don't look particularly happy or overjoyed for this situation. Neither does my youngest brother, and my brother George. He looks scared as all hell. Like, what in God's name did I just do? And as always, my wife was putting on her best face, which is always beautiful, in my opinion. But we knew what this was about. This was not a marriage of love. This is what a shotgun wedding looks like. That's her dad. That's her mom. She doesn't look like she's into it. I think realizing that the potential disaster that this thing is. They still didn't have the baby yet. She was pregnant here. And my brother, again, doesn't look like he's like, what in God's name am I doing? Now look at the look on the mother's face. She was one of the three principal people. Her father couldn't give a damn. Her father couldn't care less whether she got married or not. I met and talked with the man, but the mother did, and she didn't want to have a teenage daughter around the house with a baby that they were going to raise when they were heading into their retirement. He was a big executive, I think, in finance for American Gypsum Company based in Haverstraw. And they were about ready to retire, and they didn't want this situation. They wanted to get rid of her, and you can see that in the mother's face. I finally resolved a potential problem here by getting these two married. And my brother, you could see the disaster in his eyes. Now, look at the difference between that happy little boy with all his life before him, not knowing what his life would be, and being forced into this marriage. A marriage he wasn't qualified capable to support a family. He had no skills, no education. He was drug addicted at the time, and it was a complete and total mistake for these two to get married. And what ended up happening is, after a while, one of his clients that my brother again was doing male prostitution at the time to get the money he needed for drugs, and he ended up with this guy who was stalking him, and it was problematic for them because he was showing up at their apartment after they had just gotten married, and it was a dangerous situation for her, and the baby had just been born, so there were the three of them. And they had this goon that was following them. I just wanted to show a bit of a contrast. You saw the four pictures of my brother's wedding. Now, this is a picture of my brother in the background at my wedding. Now, this was my wedding with my wife. Just 2 months previous. And look at my brother in the background. You can't hide the truth in somebody's face. You just can't. And that's true joy that you see, true happiness that you see in his face there. And contrast that with what you just saw in those wedding pictures. He's in the background. He doesn't think he's seen there. But he was truly happy. He was truly happy for us, even though he was suffering from, severe emotional and substance abuse problems at the time. And anyway, this you can look at the difference in our look. We were ecstatic at our wedding. And we're still together 40 years. This is our 40. We're going to be, we met 40 years ago, and we got married in December 30th of 1978. So on December 30th of this year will be our 40th anniversary. So there's a huge contrast. So, yeah, I'm locked indoors a little bit with this weather. You saw that storm come up pretty fast, but it was only a matter of about a year when my brother, his best friend Charlie, and Charlie's girlfriend went to our former home in Monroe. It was on Lake Mombasha, Monroe, and he knew that the neighbor had a canoe, and it was early April. The ice had just melted only about a week or two previously off the lake in late March, and so the water was freezing cold. Now this was a canvas canoe, and it was not in kept in any good shape. It was left outdoors for probably 20 years. It was an Old Town, one of the original Old Town canoes with the wooden ribs, and the canvas was hardened and cracked. And yet they didn't think about it. They were drinking that night, and they weren't using any good judgment. And the three of them, his friend Charlie and my brother, um, went out. They took the canoe with the girlfriend. Now she sat down on the bottom. There were only two seats, so she sat between them in the middle of the canoe, on the floor with her bottom on the floor of the canoe. And as they got out into the middle of the lake, the canvas cracked, and the ice cold water just came running in, and soaked her. And she stood up. She screamed and stood up. And this was a big lake. It's a mile and a half long and 3/4 of a mile wide, and 65 feet deep. And here they were out in the middle of the night in this canvas canoe, pitch black, in water that was probably no more than 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And his friend Charlie didn't know how to swim, and they had no life preservers. She jumped up. His girlfriend, Charlie's girlfriend, jumped up, and the canoe overturned. They hit this icy water. Well, my brother and Charlie's girlfriend were good swimmers, and they were able to swim to shore. And Charlie, who couldn't swim, hung on to the side of the canoe. And when they got to shore, they were frozen. I mean, they must have been suffering from a certain degree of hypothermia. And they were calling out to Charlie, and they could hear him, and he would call back. And finally, after a small amount of time, Charlie stopped calling back. He slipped under and drowned. They didn't find his body for 2 weeks. The police dredged the lake, and eventually his body floated up, and somebody found it on the shore. That was devastating. He was my brother's closest friend, and that was devastating to my brother. These are the types of things that kept happening over and over again in his life. His wife left him for a biker, and she took the kids. After a year of marriage, they had another child, which was his child this time. And this was she was born just before Charlie died, and when Charlie died, my brother's wife moved out of the house, and she moved into a motel with a biker. Eventually, they moved into a house in Newburgh, and the house was condemned, so they were basically squatting in a condemned home. It had no water, it had no heat, and they were living in this house, and she was raising a family. She had something like 5 different children by 5 different men. They're all half siblings. My brother then went further downhill. He ended up living, after she left him. He ended up scavenging, shut down factories for copper, turning the copper in for money. He got caught once by the police and arrested for breaking an entry into one of these factories in the Hackensack area. And the Hackensack police, my dad and I went down to bail him out. And he got a probation on that. But he was still having trouble with alcohol at the time, and drugs, and he was really into some heavy duty drugs. One time we went down to my grandparents' house for a visit, and he came along with us, and his arms were up and down. His arms were track marks, and my mother, as she never skipped a beat. I mean, it was obvious what these things were, and she was, George, what are those marks on your arms? And he made up some lame excuse, and oh, you better take care of yourself, and what do you do with your free time, George? Why don't you start coming to meetings? And, this is the type of thing that we grew up with. And she's treating this, he needed help. And the last thing that, they were basically paying him off to stay away. When my father moved into the Dawn and became the managing editor of the Dawn, he would hire my brother to cut the grass, but he was basically paying him off to basically stay away from us. And it was during this time that my brother ended up living under a bridge in a box, and this was in the wintertime, in a cardboard box. He was living in, he was destitute. He was basically destitute. Finally, he got a job with the road department, the county road department, and he stuck with that for about 9 years. But then his mental state deteriorated even further. He was increasingly suicidal. He was being institutionalized on average about 3 to 4 times a year, and then eventually he was successful. When we were 19. When I was 19, I had mentioned that he had been arrested and put in the county prison for 30 days. And there was a mandate. The judge had mandated that he have counseling because of the persistence of his legal problems and the troubles. And the judge realized that there was something going on in the family for this to happen. And when he started seeing the counselor asked, he wanted to have a session with the entire family. He wanted to meet the whole family. And so the 5 of us, I never knew anything about counseling, and I didn't know what it was. I hadn't a clue about what all that was. I was just trying to survive on my own. I was having difficulty enough as it was. And by this point in time, I was almost not living at home. I was spending more time at my girlfriend's than I was with my own folks. I couldn't stand the complete total lack of discipline and the hypocrisy and the chaos that was our family. I just couldn't take it. And but anyway, we went to this counseling session, and it was in the evening, dark, and I remember we were in this little room, and the counselor, once he got us all in together, the entire family, my 2 brothers, me, and my parents, he asked, well, Does anybody have an idea as to why this George is in perennial trouble? Why is this, a why are all these problems with him repeating? And it was dead silent. My father, he didn't want to be there. My mother basically made him go. And if this wasn't a court-ordered deal, then my father wouldn't have participated at all. But he very reluctantly he went, and so after like a minute of silence, and certainly my brother George didn't say anything, I spoke up, and I I went into a very angry. Um, it wasn't a tirade. It wasn't a rant, but I was visibly upset, and I was let's say maybe passionate explanation of what was wrong, and I realized it was the imposing the religion on us, imposing their lifestyle of the religion on us. And here I was 19 years old, and I didn't understand these things. I'd never read anything about psychology. I wasn't college educated. It was just a sort of an intuitive sense that I had that this. I know how I felt. I know how I felt about how having all that imposed on me, and I realized that was it. That was the source of all the trouble. That my parents had made their commitment, made their lifestyle our commitment, our lifestyle, and that when it came to issues, when it wasn't working, they put their head in the sand, buried their head in the sand. They didn't want to face the problems. They wanted to pretend that nothing wrong was happening. They were living. My father said this over and over and over again. I lived my life beyond reproach. Why don't you do the same? And the blame was always put on my shoulders. But here, I reversed the situation. Nobody wanted to explain why they thought George was having these perennial troubles. And I went into a good maybe 10 or 15 minute, very passionate explanation about the imposition of the religion on us and its impacts on us, and how that it was wrong for them to have done that to us, and that I thought that this was the reason why my brother was in so much trouble, and I was in trouble. I was in trouble too. I was having serious self-destructive behavior and tendencies, and but I didn't deal with it the same way. My brother just was incapable. He slipped into schizophrenia, and he was just totally and utterly incapable of being able to engage in life normally. He wasn't stupid. People underestimated him. I would be shocked, especially after I went to college, and I would talk with him, and he would talk about quantum mechanics. And this is a guy that's filling potholes, and he's talking about quantum mechanics, and I studied it in college. He was a voracious reader because he had no other life. He had nothing else. And toward the end of his life, the last 5-10 years, he spent in a subsidized, government subsidized room, or eventually it was a Section 8 apartment in the last year of his life. He was a voracious reader, and he comprehended what he was reading. He had potential. He had potential. But he was also forced into suicide. He was living in so much pain. And when I get that, when I see the song and I see the lyrics and I understand, what happened to us as a family growing up, what happened to us three boys, that this idea of their commitment, our parents' commitment, devotion to the religion was supposedly love, but it wasn't love. It wasn't love for us. All the love they were giving was all meant for them. Everything they did. And there comes a time. We talk about cults, and we talk about everybody being a victim. And I take a measure of responsibility, and oftentimes there are things that come up, and I just feel absolutely awful about. It brings back memories of things that I did to my family, and I feel terrible. My conscience is devastated. I beg for forgiveness, and my wife. She's so gracious and says, you were a victim. You were a victim. You don't have to apologize. But I do believe that we are responsible. I mean, if we do have a measure of self-determinacy, there is a point in time where we make choices. We make choices. And we can make a choice to change our life for the better or change it for the worse. And we're responsible for those changes. We're responsible for those actions. And we take ownership for them. Yes, we're victims. We're victimized. And, I hear the governing body are victims. But they're also evil men. Because there's a degree of responsibility. We can't use the excuse of victims. We are responsible to whatever degree. But we are also responsible for taking the right action to rectify and for making amends and turning our life around and to make the changes. I went and got help. I got psychological help. And I worked hard at it. I worked very, very hard at it. It doesn't absolve the things that I'd done, but it allows people to forgive me for what I've done. And we've drawn, as a family, my family, the family I created, my two daughters and my wife and my grandson, we have a unit that is tight because we've made decisions, and my actions have had cascading impacts on them, and it made a difference. It makes a difference. It works. It does make a difference. But growing up in a cult is one of the hardest things to overcome and to deal with. The psychological effects, the impacts that it has on people's actions, people's choices, the things that they want, their aspirations, and the ramifications of those aspirations, and the neglect that as a result of the parasitic religion causing people to put their priorities into that cult, into that religion, and to some extent there is some degree of responsibility on the part of the person who is victimized by the cult. There is a degree of responsibility there. The people are not completely dulled and lured in. There have to be questions, doubts. I know in my mind there were, but for me it moved in a different direction. I took different action. For others, they conform, and then they support the system, and that's how such systems continue. And that's how evil persists. But anyway, this has become a very long video, and I'm sorry, but this, I feel strongly because I still hurt from my brother and what it drove him to do. I go through periods where I break down from his loss because I did love him. He was my brother. And he's gone. So, anyway, if this is a bit of a downer, I'm sorry. But this is why cults are so devastating and so damaging. My brother is proof positive of that. And he wasn't the only one. I've known a number of my peers growing up ended up in very tragic circumstances, not very different from my brother. Suicides and just disasters, and that was that's in the Bible students, and so anyway, I don't want to belabor this too much, but I just wanted to speak out on behalf of my brother, and I guess kind of speak about the impact it had on me, and the pain that it's caused, because it hurts. It hurts, and I still hurt that my brother chose the avenue that he did. And anyway, next time, maybe I'll have something a little bit brighter, but maybe something a little more analytical. But you did get to see my grandson, and I would give anything in the world for him. He's a beautiful little thing, beautiful little thing. Nothing would ever take any more priority for me than that little boy and his best welfare. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker here, wishing you the best. The storm's cleared away, the sun's coming out, and maybe I might try and sink my second drone. Yeah, I sank my drone yesterday in the lake. I think a propeller came off. But anyway, I got a backup, so I wish you all the best.